Cancun, Mexico, March 23, 2019. Ricardo Vega Salazar, the operational commander of the Sinaloa Cartel's Gulf Coast Trafficking Network, and the man personally responsible for coordinating shipments that had moved approximately 47 tons of cocaine and 12 tons of methamphetamine into the United States between 2015 and 2019, sat on the rear deck of a 72-foot luxury yacht anchored 800 meters offshore in the turquoise waters of Cancun's hotel zone, believing he was safely insulated from law enforcement action by the multiple layers of security he had established around his operations and by the corrupt Mexican officials he had paid millions of dollars to ensure he would receive advance warning of any operations targeting him. What Vega Salazar did not know was that two CIA-contracted snipers positioned on the roof of a beachfront hotel 847 meters away had been tracking his movements through high-powered optics for the previous 72 hours, and that within the next 180 seconds, one of those snipers would fire a shot that would travel nearly half a mile across open water to strike Vega Salazar in the head with precision that would later be described by ballistics experts as representing one of the most technically difficult long-range shots ever successfully executed in a counter-narcotics operation. A shot that would be complicated by multiple environmental factors, including wind conditions that varied across the bullet's flight path, the movement of the yacht on ocean swells, the curvature of the Earth affecting bullet trajectory over such distance, and the need to time the shot precisely to avoid collateral casualties to the 4 bodyguards and 2 civilian staff members who were present on the yacht at the moment of execution. The operation to eliminate Ricardo Vega Salazar represented the culmination of a joint CIA-DEA intelligence operation that had been developed over 18 months following the identification of Vega Salazar as a high-value target whose removal would significantly disrupt Sinaloa cartel operations along Mexico's Caribbean coast, and whose elimination could not be accomplished through traditional law enforcement means because of the extensive corruption network he had established within Mexican federal and state police agencies that made conventional arrest operations impossible without his receiving advance warning that would allow him to flee to locations where he could not be reached. The decision to pursue an elimination operation rather than an arrest operation had been made at senior levels within the CIA and DEA following assessments that concluded that Vega Salazar's role in coordinating cartel operations that were directly responsible for deaths of American citizens through drug overdoses and through violence associated with drug trafficking justified lethal action under authorities that permitted the United States to conduct operations against transnational criminal organizations whose activities threatened American national security interests. Ricardo Vega Salazar had been born in Culiacan, Sinaloa in 1978 and had been recruited into the Sinaloa cartel in the late 1990s during a period when the organization was expanding its operations and was actively seeking individuals with logistics and operations management capabilities who could coordinate the increasingly complex supply chains required to move large quantities of drugs from production areas in South America and Mexico to distribution networks in the United States. Vega Salazar had demonstrated exceptional organizational abilities and a capacity for violence that had allowed him to rise rapidly within the cartel's hierarchy, despite the organization's preference for promoting individuals with family connections to existing leadership, a preference that Vega Salazar had overcome through his effectiveness in managing operations and through his willingness to personally participate in enforcement actions against rivals and against cartel members who were suspected of disloyalty or theft. By the mid-2010s, Vega Salazar had become the cartel's primary operational commander for Gulf Coast operations, a position that gave him responsibility for coordinating cocaine and methamphetamine shipments that arrived by sea from Colombia and Venezuela, and that were transshipped through Mexico's Caribbean coast to the United States border and into American distribution networks. Intelligence assessments estimated that operations under Vega Salazar's control were responsible for approximately 15% of cocaine entering the United States through the Texas-Mexico border corridor, and approximately 20% of methamphetamine entering through the same corridor, quantities that generated revenues estimated at $800 million to $1.2 billion annually, and that contributed to drug overdose deaths that numbered in the thousands across American cities where Sinaloa cartel products were distributed. American intelligence agencies had been tracking Vega Salazar since 2012, but had been unable to develop actionable intelligence that would allow his arrest or elimination because he maintained extraordinarily strict operational security protocols that included avoiding electronic communications that could be intercepted, using multiple layers of intermediaries to insulate himself from direct contact with trafficking operations, maintaining multiple residences, and constantly rotating between locations to prevent surveillance teams from establishing patterns that could be exploited, and ensuring that corrupt Mexican officials provided him with advance warning whenever American or Mexican law enforcement agencies began developing operations that might target him. Multiple DEA attempts to develop cases that could lead to Vega Salazar's arrest had been frustrated by the inability to gather evidence that would meet American legal standards for prosecution, and by Mexican government reluctance to pursue aggressive operations against senior cartel figures whose elimination might trigger succession conflicts that could escalate violence in ways that would threaten Mexican political stability. The breakthrough that ultimately led to the operation targeting Vega Salazar came in September 2018 when CIA signals intelligence specialists identified a pattern in encrypted communications between Cancun and Culiacan that analysis suggested might be related to Vega Salazar's operations, communications that used sophisticated encryption that could not be decrypted through standard technical means, but that could be analyzed for patterns that revealed information about timing and locations of communications even when content could not be accessed. The pattern analysis suggested that someone matching Vega Salazar's operational profile was maintaining a regular presence in the Cancun area and was coordinating operations from that location rather than from the cartel's traditional operational bases in Sinaloa and other Western Mexican states, a pattern that represented a departure from previous behavior that created a potential vulnerability that might be exploited. CIA case officers working with DEA counterparts developed a plan to confirm whether Vega Salazar was indeed operating from Cancun, and to develop intelligence that could support an operation to eliminate him if his presence could be confirmed, and if an operational approach could be identified that would minimize risks of collateral casualties, and that would avoid creating evidence of American involvement that might complicate relations with Mexican government authorities who officially opposed American unilateral operations on Mexican territory, but who unofficially tolerated such operations when they were conducted with sufficient discretion to maintain plausible deniability. The confirmation operation involved deploying human intelligence sources to Cancun who could identify locations where Vega Salazar might be residing or conducting business. Sources who were recruited from among Mexican nationals with connections to hotel and tourism industries in Cancun, who could observe wealthy Mexican visitors without creating suspicion, and who could provide information about individuals who exhibited security behaviors consistent with cartel operations. By December 2018, CIA sources had identified a luxury villa in Cancun's hotel zone that was being used by an individual whose security profile and behavior patterns matched intelligence assessments of how Vega Salazar would operate. An individual who maintained a security detail of 6 to 8 armed bodyguards who rotated in shifts and who conducted counter-surveillance activities characteristic of professional cartel security operations, who rarely left the villa except to board a yacht that was kept anchored offshore and that he would visit using a tender boat, and who received visitors who arrived in vehicles with security details suggesting they were cartel operatives conducting business meetings. Physical surveillance of the villa and yacht was conducted using long-range observation posts established in hotel rooms and rental properties with sightlines to the locations, observation posts that were staffed by CIA contractors with extensive experience in surveillance operations and with technical capabilities including high-resolution cameras and sophisticated optics that could capture imagery sufficient to confirm identities through facial recognition analysis. Facial recognition analysis of imagery captured during surveillance operations confirmed in January 2019 that the individual using the villa and yacht was indeed Ricardo Vega Salazar. Confirmation that was based on matching surveillance imagery to photographs from Mexican government databases and from previous DEA intelligence files that contained images of Vega Salazar from earlier periods in his career. The confirmation triggered planning for an elimination operation that would need to address multiple tactical challenges, including the heavily armed security detail that surrounded Vega Salazar at all times, the difficulty of conducting an operation in a densely populated tourist area where any action that resulted in public awareness of American military or intelligence presence would create diplomatic complications, and the need to execute the operation in a manner that would minimize risks of casualties to Mexican civilians or tourists who might be present in areas where operations were conducted. The operational approach that was ultimately selected involved using precision long-range sniper fire to eliminate Vega Salazar while he was aboard his yacht, an approach that offered several advantages, including the ability to strike from a distance that would minimize risks of the shooter being compromised or captured, the ability to conduct the operation from a location in the hotel zone that could be secured and evacuated quickly after the shot was fired, and the ability to time the operation for moments when Vega Salazar was relatively isolated on the yacht deck with minimal risk of collateral casualties to his security detail or to yacht crew members who American intelligence assessed were likely innocent civilians employed by Vega Salazar under false pretenses that concealed his criminal activities. The decision to pursue a long-range precision shooting operation required identification of shooters with capabilities that few individuals possessed, capabilities that included the ability to make accurate shots at ranges exceeding 800 meters under field conditions with environmental variables that would affect bullet trajectory and that would require real-time calculations and adjustments that depended on both technical training and on instinctive judgment developed through years of experience in long-range precision shooting. The CIA contracted with two former military snipers who had extensive experience in special operations and who had successfully executed long-range precision shooting operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. Snipers whose identities remain classified, but whom we will refer to as John and Michael. Individuals who had left military service, but who maintained relationships with CIA that allowed them to be contracted for specialized operations where their unique skills were required. John and Michael were deployed to Cancun in February 2019 under cover identities as American tourists, identities that were supported by documentation and cover stories that would allow them to blend into the tourist population and that would provide explanations for their presence in the hotel zone that would not create suspicion if Mexican authorities became aware of them. The snipers established their operational position on the roof of a beachfront hotel that had been selected based on multiple factors, including its distance and angle to the location where Vega Salazar's yacht typically anchored, its height relative to the water surface that would provide optimal shooting geometry, its accessibility through service areas that could be accessed without passing through public spaces where their movements might be observed by hotel guests or staff, and its location in a section of the hotel zone where post-operation evacuation could be accomplished quickly using pre-positioned vehicles and routes that would allow the team to reach secure locations before Mexican police could establish roadblocks or checkpoints. The shooting position on the hotel roof was prepared over several days during periods when hotel staff were not present in areas where preparation activities might be observed. Preparation that included establishing a concealed position using materials that would blend with rooftop structures and that would not be visible from ground level or from other buildings, installing range finding and environmental monitoring equipment that would provide real-time data about wind conditions and atmospheric factors that would affect bullet trajectory, and conducting rehearsals using laser rangefinders to confirm distances and angles and to practice the timing and coordination that would be required during the actual operation. The preparation included detailed analysis of environmental conditions that would affect the shot, including wind patterns that varied based on time of day and that changed across the nearly half-mile distance the bullet would travel, ocean swell patterns that would cause the yacht to move vertically and horizontally in ways that would require the shooter to time the shot to coincide with specific phases of the yacht's movement, temperature and humidity conditions that would affect air density and therefore bullet velocity and trajectory, and Earth's curvature effects that would cause the bullet to drop more than would be expected based on gravity alone because of the extended range over which the shot would be taken. The rifle that would be used for the operation was a custom-built precision weapon chambered in .338 Lapua Magnum, a cartridge that had been selected because it provided sufficient energy to remain lethal at extended ranges while offering better ballistic coefficients than larger calibers that might be more affected by wind drift over the 847-meter distance that separated the shooting position from the typical location of Vega Salazar's yacht. The rifle was equipped with a high magnification optic with ballistic reticles that would allow precise holdovers for the extreme range, and with environmental sensors integrated into the scope that would provide real-time wind and atmospheric data that could be used for last-second trajectory calculations. The ammunition was match-grade precision rounds that had been hand-loaded to exact specifications that would minimize variations in velocity and trajectory that could cause misses at extreme range, where even minor deviations of a few feet per second in muzzle velocity could translate into misses of several feet at target distance. Surveillance of Vega Salazar's patterns during February and early March 2019 established that he typically visited his yacht 3 to 4 times per week, usually in late afternoon or early evening, and that he would spend between 1 and 3 hours aboard during these visits, time he appeared to use for conducting business meetings with associates who would arrive by tender boat and for personal relaxation during periods when no meetings were scheduled. The surveillance also established that Vega Salazar's security procedures aboard the yacht typically involved positioning 2 bodyguards on the forward deck and 2 on the rear deck, positioning that kept him under constant observation, but that also created periods when he would be relatively isolated on one section of the deck, while bodyguards were positioned at distances that would minimize risks of collateral casualties if a precision shot could be timed to strike him. During these moments of relative isolation, the decision to execute the operation was made on March 22, 2019, following intelligence that indicated Vega Salazar would visit his yacht the following afternoon, and that weather conditions were forecast to be favorable for long-range shooting with relatively calm winds and clear visibility that would allow the sniper team to observe the target clearly and to make accurate environmental calculations. John and Michael moved into their shooting position on the hotel roof at approximately 2:01 p.m. on March 23rd, timing that allowed them to establish their position several hours before Vega Salazar was expected to arrive at his yacht, and that provided time for final equipment checks and for monitoring environmental conditions as they evolved during the afternoon. Vega Salazar departed his villa at approximately 4:15 p.m. in a tender boat with 4 bodyguards and arrived at his yacht at approximately 4:22 p.m., timing that was communicated to the sniper team by CIA surveillance personnel who were monitoring the villa and who maintained radio contact with John and Michael using encrypted communications that could not be intercepted by Mexican authorities. Vega Salazar boarded the yacht and spent approximately 35 minutes in the yacht's interior cabin, time during which the sniper team maintained observation through their optics and confirmed their range calculations and environmental assessments while waiting for Vega Salazar to emerge onto the deck where a shot could be taken. At approximately 4:58 p.m., Vega Salazar emerged from the yacht's interior and moved to a seating area on the rear deck, where he sat in a chair facing toward the stern, positioning that placed him in a location where he was partially isolated from his bodyguards, who were positioned forward and where the geometry of the shot would minimize risks of the bullet continuing beyond Vega Salazar if it passed through him or if it missed, risks that had been carefully analyzed during planning because the consequences of stray bullets striking Mexican civilians or tourist in the hotel zone would be catastrophic for the operation's diplomatic and legal justifications. John, who had been designated as the primary shooter with Michael serving as spotter and backup, began his final pre-shot routine at approximately 5:01 p.m., routine that included confirming wind conditions using visual observation of wave patterns and using electronic wind sensors, confirming range using laser rangefinder that measured the exact distance at 847 meters, calculating the ballistic solution that would account for bullet drop over that distance and for wind drift based on current conditions, and observing Vega Salazar's position and the yacht's movement to identify the optimal moment to take the shot when the yacht's motion would place Vega Salazar in a position where the ballistic solution would result in a hit. The environmental conditions at 5:01 p.m. included winds that were measured at 8 to 12 miles per hour from the northeast, winds that would push the bullet to the left from the shooter's perspective, and that would require a windage correction of approximately 18 inches at the target distance. Atmospheric pressure that was slightly elevated relative to standard conditions, and that would affect air density and therefore bullet velocity in ways that required minor adjustments to elevation calculations, and temperature of 84 degrees Fahrenheit that was warmer than the temperature at which the rifle had been zeroed, and that would cause the bullet to fly slightly higher than it would under cooler conditions, an effect that required approximately 6 inches of hold under at the target distance. At approximately 5:02:30 p.m., Michael, observing through a spotting scope that provided higher magnification than John's rifle scope and that allowed more detailed observation of conditions at the target, confirmed that environmental conditions were stable and that Vega Salazar was in a position where a shot could be taken with minimal risk of collateral casualties, confirmation that was communicated to John through the simple statement, "Send it," terminology that indicated Michael had assessed that all conditions were optimal for the shot and that John should execute at his discretion based on his observation of the yacht's movement and his judgment about the precise moment when the ballistic solution would result in a hit. John began his breathing cycle to stabilize his position and to time the shot for the natural respiratory pause that would occur between breaths when his body would be most stable and when muscle tension would be minimized. Breathing cycle that took approximately 8 seconds, during which he maintained his sight picture through the rifle scope, with the reticle positioned at the calculated aim point that would account for bullet drop and wind drift. The yacht's movement on ocean swells was causing Vega Salazar to rise and fall approximately 18 inches vertically, with a period of approximately 4 seconds, movement that required John to time the shot for a specific phase of the yacht's motion, when Vega Salazar would be at a height that matched his ballistic calculations, and when the yacht's horizontal movement would not introduce additional complexities that would affect the shot's accuracy. At approximately 5:02:47 p.m., 17 seconds after Michael had confirmed that conditions were optimal, John squeezed the trigger during his natural respiratory pause, and at a moment when his observation of the yacht's movement indicated that Vega Salazar was in the optimal position for the ballistic solution he had calculated. The rifle fired with the sharp crack characteristic of high-velocity precision rifles, the sound suppressed slightly by a muzzle device that reduced noise signature, but that could not completely eliminate the sound of supersonic bullet flight. The recoil pushed the rifle back against John's shoulder with force that was significant, but that was controlled through his shooting position and through his grip on the rifle that allowed him to maintain his sight picture through the scope to observe the bullet's impact. The bullet, a 300-grain projectile traveling at approximately 2,750 feet per second as it left the rifle's muzzle, flew for approximately 1.2 seconds across the distance that separated the shooting position from Vega Salazar's location, time during which it lost velocity due to air resistance, and during which its trajectory was affected by gravity, causing it to drop, and by wind causing it to drift, effects that had been anticipated in John's aim point calculations, but that introduced uncertainties because environmental conditions could not be known with absolute precision along the entire flight path, and because small variations in rifle mechanics or in ammunition performance could introduce deviations that would become significant at such extreme range. The bullet struck Vega Salazar in the head slightly left of center, impact that occurred at approximately 5:02:48 p.m., and that was immediately visible through the scopes that John and Michael were using to observe the target, impact that caused Vega Salazar to collapse immediately in the chair where he was sitting with catastrophic trauma that was instantly fatal. The precision of the shot that had placed the bullet within approximately 2 inches of the calculated aim point, despite the extreme range and despite the environmental variables that had affected the bullet's flight, would later be described by ballistics experts who reviewed the operation as representing world-class shooting that demonstrated exceptional skill and judgment on the part of the shooter, and that achieved results that very few individuals would be capable of duplicating under similar conditions. The bodyguards aboard the yacht reacted to the sound of impact and to Vega Salazar's collapse with immediate alarm, but with confusion about what had occurred, confusion that lasted for several seconds, during which they scanned their immediate surroundings looking for threats without initially recognizing that the attack had come from long range and from a direction that was not immediately obvious. The delay in their recognition of what had occurred provided critical seconds for John and Michael to begin their evacuation from the shooting position, evacuation that involved quickly breaking down their equipment and moving from the hotel roof through pre-planned routes that would take them through service corridors to ground level where a vehicle was waiting to extract them from the area.